The United Nations has been all over the news this week, so I thought we should talk about it. What's the connection? What if war doesn't just destroy human lives, but also forests, rivers, and even other species? That's what Dr. András Hárs and I talk about on this week's Wild Connection. You're listening to Wild Connection, where every conversation is a journey into what it means to be part of this wild and complicated world. I'm your host, Dr. Jen, and I talk with scientists, authors, and changemakers about people, nature, and the surprising connections that tie us all together. Welcome back to Wild Connection. Today's conversation takes us into the heart of international conflict, the United Nations, and how all of this intersects with climate change, migration, and, you guessed it, wildlife. I first met today's guest, Dr. András Hárs, in Kazakhstan, where we were both giving lectures at Narhos University's Global Immersion Summer Program. I was fascinated by his lecture. He laid out so many different aspects of the United Nations I'd never fully understood before. And as I listened, I couldn't help but connect the dots to my own work in applied conservation and thinking about how conflict shapes landscapes, how migration, both human and animal, responds to stress, and how sustainability goals tie it all together. Now, on the schedule was my conversation with Tamara Dean, but after the drama that unfolded at the United Nations in New York this past week, I thought it was the perfect moment to bring András on instead. He's a senior lecturer in international law at the University of Public Service in Budapest. András, it's so wonderful to see you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I first met you in, of all places, Kazakhstan, where we were both giving lectures at Narhos University for their first ever Global Immersion Summer Program. And I was fascinated by your lecture. You do work on United Nations, and you laid out so many aspects of the United Nations that I've never fully understood. And as I listened, I couldn't help but connect sort of the dots of what you were talking about to where I am familiar with the United Nations in terms of sustainability goals and thinking about my own work in conservation, which takes me to places that have had conflict. And so I was thinking about how conflict shapes, landscapes, migration, both human and animal, how they respond to stress, and how sustainability sort of ties it all together. And you've had this incredible journey in conflict resolution and international law. And I was just kind of curious if you could introduce yourself to listeners about what drew you into this, field and what keeps you working on such big, really global, complex challenges.
Thanks for the question. To have a very brief answer, there were two major things that I can identify that have led me to this topic. The first one was just seeing documentaries in the roughly early mid-2000s about the Rwandan genocide and how peacekeepers were there and how the UN wasn't exactly the most successful in handling the Rwandan genocide. And that has caused a lot of questions to be asked on my end. Like, how is this possible? How is it still possible in the mid-1990s to have a genocide right before our eyes when we have, TVs and we can see it in live action? So this sort of failure of the international community was quite apparent and quite appalling to me. So I was beginning to ask, well, is there a way to make it better? How does this really work? And the second thing was that back in my high school years, which followed through university, I was drawn into Model United Nations. And we began, just some enthusiast high schoolers. We became interested in the topic. We began participating and then organizing them. And this has lasted for a couple of years. And then when an opportunity arose to pursue PhD studies, this is what I've chosen. And then this has just basically sucked me in. So this is where I am right now.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it's so interesting, right? Because so much of your work focuses on, if I'm correct, legal sort of accountability for peacekeepers and the United Nations. And do you think that there's also kind of I mean, you've touched on it, right? That witnessing this, how could the international community allow this when we could see it unfolding? Do you think that there's a moral accountability for the international community, not only to protect people during conflict, but to do more than just protect people? Should they also be protecting the landscapes and the environment that people and other animals depend on?
Well, in theory, I would say that yes, of course, there's a definite burden on the international community, but then we have to take a step back and ask, okay, but who is the international community? Is it the UN? Is it states? Is it international organizations? Do we count NGOs? So whose responsibility is it? Because it's easy to say, well, the international community didn't do its part, but who didn't do their part really? So we can pinpoint the UN as sort of the torchbearer of all responsibilities, because this is an organization with basically general competencies. So it's supposed to maintain international peace and security, help with humanitarian affairs, eliminate starvation, and so on. You have mentioned the SDGs. It's a very ambitious set of goals to work towards. But is it only the UN's responsibility? Because although it's a separate, from a legal perspective, it's a separate legal entity, it's comprised of states. And the UN is only as strong as states basically allow it to be. And I think this is sort of my first takeaway from this entire session, is that we can have wonderful international agreements drafted by the UN, but if states say no because we don't sign up to these ideas, or it's just too much, or it's too expensive, or we don't know how to implement them, then it becomes basically either a piece of paper or not even that. A very good example can be seen, for example, because I think it was in August this year when we had the draft plastics treaty, which would have been fantastic, but there was basically no end to the dispute, and at the end the negotiators said, well, this is just too much, and this is not something we can right now agree on. And this applies also for accountability as well, by the way.
Well, it's interesting. I kind of want to back up for a second because I realized, of course, I'm now talking to you as if I know something about the UN because I listened to your lecture. And I'm wondering if there might be just sort of a broad kind of misunderstanding about what is the United Nations. And so could you give us a little brief introduction to what is the United Nations? How did it come about? And what is its purpose, or what was its purpose? And how might that have evolved and changed over time?
Yeah. The UN, well, we consider this sort of the most prominent of international organizations out of, 500-600 of them, because this was created with the goal of maintaining international peace and security. So that was the distinct goal. If you are to count success, for example, whether this is a successful organization or not, you can have widely opposing views. Because if the goal was to avoid another world war, like how the League of Nations has failed, because there was a Second World War, then you can say that the UN, well, this is the most successful organization because for 80 years now we have avoided a new world war. But if you say, well, did it eliminate all wars? Then, well, just look around. It really didn't do enough. So the UN always had this ambiguity of what exactly is its goal, because in the UN Charter itself, it says the maintenance of international peace and security. Okay, but how do you interpret it? So these are the two interpretations that it has, and it has a lot of tasks. So it deals with all manners of humanitarian affairs, of even engaging states on a wide plethora of economic, financial, commercial, communications, and so on. So all manners of issues is being discussed at the UN. But this is what it is first and foremost. It's a forum for discussion.
Right.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So I think there might be a perception, at least maybe there had been for me, that if the UN, comes out with this is what's happening, that there's collective agreement. But as you've already pointed out, it needs the collective action of all the states to actually implement whatever the decisions are, and you may or may not have that. When you talked about how the genocide in Rwanda, sparked your attention and focus in this area. You've also written about the Central African Republic, and it's a site both of UN peacekeeping operations and serious allegations of misconduct. And what struck me listening to your lecture at Nathos and what I keep thinking about is that Central African Republic is also part of the range of endangered Western lowland gorillas, just as the mountain gorillas where I work and Windy and also in Rwanda are vulnerable to when these kind of conflicts erupt in these places. And they're on the front lines of that conflict alongside people. And so instability in the Central African Republic has led to poaching, deforestation, the collapse of ecotourism, which is one of the few sustainable sources of revenue for local communities. So when we talk about accountability and peacekeeping, I feel like we think about it in terms of human justice, but there's this other indirect toll on wildlife. So I'd love to, get your take on how do you think international institutions, like the United Nations, should be thinking about environmental conservation when engaged in peacekeeping activities in these kinds of places.
You bring up a lot of interesting points, so I'll try to answer them one by one, or as I can recall them. For the UN or how it tackles these issues is that, first of all, it has sort of a program, the UNEP, the UN's environmental program, established in 1972. So very early on, during the so-called early decades of the UN, the environmental agenda was put forward. However, if you take a closer look at it, it's UNEP, it's the UN's environmental program. It's not a separate organization. It's not a specialized agency, and you may ask why not. So why is it possible to establish a specialized agency with separate, legal personality in terms of finance, in terms of even intellectual property and labor, but not regarding environmental protection? And that's because there's very little concrete cooperation between states in this field, and there's even a very hot debate right now of who should pay the lion's share in these endeavors. So this is a so-called the global north, global south divide, in which the global north will say, well, let's all do our part, to which the global south replies, yes, but you have done more to cause environmental devastation. You were responsible for the Industrial Revolution. You have been benefiting from coal mines for 200 years. We're just getting into that technology. So why should we pay as much as you do? Why should we skip that part and move to right now the more expensive green energies? So that's a debate, and that's a continuous point of contention between several players, and that is why it's very hard for the UN to coordinate and to make sure that the states are actually cooperating in practice. But with that said, it's not all dark because the UN does have a lot of very promising initiatives. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, which is guiding, orienting states, making sure that they are actually harmonizing conduct. One very positive sort of tale that I can tell is that we say that the SDGs are just guidelines. But when I was in the Sudan back in December 2018, there in a lot of government buildings even, and this was the height of the dictator, so-called waning days of the dictatorship. There they also had the SDGs printed on government buildings, museums, and so on, because for them even there it was quite important due to being a hotspot for migration, due to the tense situation of the Nile and the dispute between Ethiopia and Egypt regarding the river management and so on. So for a lot of countries, this is just a piece of paper. This is just an idea, while others are striving towards it very, very consistently, so to say.
It's so interesting that you brought that up. There's a perfect example, right? I mean, if Ethiopia built that dam because they said, well, we can. And I think this is also, I heard a little bit about this in Kazakhstan, between China and Kazakhstan. There's water flow. It's very important for the people in Kazakhstan. And there's some, whenever somebody can control water, they can really control many, many things and create significant problems, not just for people, but also for wildlife. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I've seen those sustainability goals. I see them even in Uganda printed on, in government buildings, and people are constantly talking about them. I also went to COP26 in Scotland, and that was my first time attending a Congress of Parties. And it was a fascinating experience. And so I'm wondering, has the United Nations had any role in any of the Congress of Parties and the outcomes of those?
Of course. One word about the SDGs is that this is a point that my students bring up most of the time, that the SDGs are unrealistic, that they say, oh, let's eliminate hunger, let's eliminate poverty, let's reduce starvation to get to an absolute zero. And they say, why don't we have obtainable goals? To which the answer is, well, these are good goals actually, because there's always something to strive towards. You cannot, lean back, pat yourself on the back and say, well, we have achieved this. Now there's nothing for us to do. So there's always something to strive towards, and then you can show the results of how close you actually came to meet those goals. But to actually answer your question, the COPs, those are, well, it's abbreviated COP, but it's the Conference of Parties.
Oh, Conference of Parties. Sorry.
Conference of Parties. That's okay. It's a technicality, basically, of what you call it. However, these were created as a follow-up event of certain international treaties, and the underlying logic is that it's very good to have international treaties, but if there's no monitoring, if there's no follow-up, they often just remain pieces of paper. So we had major events like the Rio conference back in 1992, in which there was the Biodiversity Convention and so on. So it's very interesting to follow up on these issues of climate change, of biodiversity protection, and so on. So state parties gather and they decide on these issues. Now, all of these treaties are basically what they call sponsored by the UN or adopted under the aegis of the UN. And this means that even though the UN is not a party to these, because the states are the parties to these conventions, the UN is responsible for hammering out the earlier versions of the text. It is usually coming up with a basic text that then states can debate on. They can amend, they can try to find points of compromise. Sometimes it is successful, sometimes it is not. So the UN is sort of in the back trying to come up with sort of the technical scientific compromise through its specialized agencies, through channeling thousands of NGOs into its work. And then there's a draft text that it puts forward to states. And then, of course, since this is climate, it is changing year by year. So states need to step up their game all the time. Why I think that the COP is actually valuable is because it is putting pressure on states to come up with new things to promise every year. This might just be, that promises, but it at least pressures state leaders to go there, to make their promises. And then there's sort of the media accountability that they will get, that they can be asked later on, well, you have promised this during COP 2678. What are the results? And now, of course, we have COP 30 coming around in November in Belém, Brazil, which is shaping up to be the largest yet. However, it also has some downsides. There have been some criticisms regarding the petroleum industry lobby surrounding the COPs. And of course, it leaves a huge carbon footprint because you have to have, not just the state representatives, but a lot of media, a lot of security, basically everyone coming to the area. And even according to Brazilian news, there have been deforestation as a result of COP needing new hotels, new establishments to facilitate the event itself. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. It has a lot of positives, but it can have a very negative footprint as well if not handled correctly.
Yeah, I actually thought about that as well in when I was in Glasgow. For that one, I thought about what an intense sort of ecological effort it was and impact it had to bring that many people to talk about the very thing that they just engaged in and how to not do it as much. But,
Indeed.
that was my very simplistic sort of impression. I was like, wow, okay. I want to circle back a little bit now to where you've done a lot of your work in terms of the accountability for misconduct in during peacekeeping. When peacekeepers commit crimes, who is actually responsible? Is it the United Nations itself as an entity? Is it the contributing state, so whoever they belonged to, or both? Who is responsible when that happens?
Here we have to differentiate between individual criminal responsibility and between the responsibility of either states or international organizations, or maybe both. I would say the simplest thing to answer is that of individual criminal responsibility. So there have been news back in the early 1990s where peacekeepers have been, for example, smuggling endangered wildlife from the countries where they were deployed in, and that means that they should be criminally liable for their conduct. To the best of our knowledge, we have no evidence that peacekeepers have committed international crimes. So this is not reaching the level of war crimes or crimes against humanity. The UN, of course, wouldn't really tolerate that. So it's not international responsibility; it's always domestic responsibility. So when they do something, for example, bringing endangered wildlife out of the country, then that means that they are themselves responsible, but it's not under whole state law. So if let's say, just to use an example, they will be smuggling gorillas out of the Central African Republic. Although this is going to be a crime, most likely under the laws of the Central African Republic, still these peacekeepers are protected by international agreements that they should not, basically never be held responsible. They have almost full immunity regarding what they are doing on the territory of the host state. So what can be done is that they are being repatriated, and then the contributing country is asked to conduct the investigation and to apply its own domestic laws. That is what can be done.
I see. So, so that's really interesting, right? And so, how does when peacekeepers engage in misconduct of any kind, right? How does that affect trust in the United Nations, sort of legitimacy or ability to provide security?
As you can imagine, it is not helping either the mission's goals. It doesn't really support the reputation of the UN. And this ties to the second part of the question: is it the responsibility of the UN or the state? The short answer is it depends on under whose effective control the peacekeepers have been operating. Because if the state has been giving them orders, then it's usually the responsibility of the state. If the UN is actually telling them what to do, pinpointing the exact tasks, then the U.S. responsibility is going to be tackled. How this was analyzed, although the conclusion was a little bit different, was regarding the massacre of Srebrenica back in 1995, where it was revealed that the Dutch government had actually overridden the commands given by UN headquarters to protect civilians. And instead, they told the Dutch peacekeepers to protect themselves and allow the civilians to be transferred to the custody of the Bosnian Serbian troops, and then they were transported to the back of the forest and then shot. But there was an independent inquiry which revealed that the Dutch government was actually directly overriding or giving contravening instructions to their own troops. Well, there are several ways to avoid it. For example, use smaller battalions. So let's make sure that states are actually not providing, 1,500 troops in a bulk, but they're being divided. However, if you're the UN, you cannot really cherry pick, because you don't have contributors lining up saying, I want to donate a few thousand here and there. You get what you're given. So if China or Ethiopia or the Netherlands, for example, will say, I would like to contribute with some forces, the UN cannot really be too picky in saying we will divide them because we believe that this is a good choice. They will just accept them as they are in most cases. But back to the original topic of the reputation to the UN. Of course, it undermines the reputation of the UN, and this is especially true for crimes committed by peacekeepers, especially crimes of sexual nature. Because if and when those are committed, then how do you obtain the goals of the mandate of the Security Council's instructions? You gain the trust of the local population. It's very hard to gain the trust of the local population if you're actually committing crimes against them. So that's why the UN is imposing zero tolerance policies. That's why the UN is trying to engage in a wide manner of investigative action, of trying to convince states to conduct these investigations, because that's a main hurdle. Let's face it. The states are simply not incentivized. It's not in their interest to conduct these investigations, because if they have to travel a few continents to conduct these investigations, the result is that we have to jail our own peacekeepers. How is it in our interest? But of course, it's in the interest of the UN. But that ties to another important thing to note here, is that if there's success to be had, states are very happy to say that, well, we have contributed to this one. If there's blame to be given, well, it's the UN's fault always. So this is sort of a double-edged sword also, because even for success, the UN has to sort of marketing it very heavily. But the UN can never compete with the media apparatus of states. If you just take a look at the number of followers, for example, on Twitter or X or any social media platform of either the British Prime Minister or the American President, compare that to the UN Secretary General, well, it's a small fraction of it. The same can be said about the UN Security Council sessions. Who's following them? Live streams, around a few hundred, maybe a few thousand people at most,
right,
on a globe with 8 billion people. So right. It's not exactly in the central sort of mind of people. It is not given enough attention as it is. So it's very hard to explain things, and that's why the UN in a lot of cases is a very good punching bag, because it cannot really fight back.
Right. Speaking of watching things, and maybe more people will be thinking about the United Nations this week. I don't want to become political. This is not a political show. This is about thinking about our connection with the environment and nature. But I do want to bring us into the present moment, because it's very relevant to this conversation. This week, the U.S. president gave a speech. I don't know even how to describe it, but he gave a speech attacking climate policies, framing migration as a threat, and even using sort of technical glitches as a symbol of dysfunction of the United Nations. And listening to that speech, I was struck by how much of it was not accurate. Not the least of which was the idea that migration somehow signals the downfall of civilizations. And we know during, conflict, when UN peacekeepers might even come in, there's refugees that are fleeing. I mean, this just recently happened in the Congo. But if we look to the past, we see the opposite. Climate shifts, especially in the Pleistocene, which, drove waves of human migration that shaped our survival as a species, as well as others, and facilitated and fueled our spread across the globe. So, for example, during the last glacial maximum, which was between 26 and 19,000 years ago, these massive ice sheets that covered much of North America, and Europe melted. They retreated, and as they retreated, you get new habitat and movement corridors that open, and especially this happened, allowing some populations to move south from Beringia, and so migration is part of our history. It always has been. Of course, now we have nations or states that have borders, and wildlife doesn't recognize borders. Like they don't. To them, it's a migratory corridor, and so from migration doesn't cause societal collapse, right? So I don't have a ton of background in this sort of history, but from Mesopotamia and the Mayans to the Ming Dynasty, factors like overexploitation of resources, which ties to the sustainability goals of the United Nations, political instability, which ties to the peacekeeping elements of the United Nations, and the failure of governance, which is the lack of states doing their part in that collective sort of agreement. These are the reasons why civilizations collapse. So, given your experience and all the work that you've done in this field, how does rhetoric like this, where climate change is, climate action is mocked, migration is demonized, and how does that affect the UN's ability and credibility to, instead of fall back, but increase their influence in these really important issues that are going and do affect all of us?
Ooh, these are quite a lot of points to tackle in just one go. The first one is regarding the criticisms. This is not the first time that the U.S. president is having critical remarks on the UN. Even during his first presidency, he has criticized several institutions, and indeed we can see that the U.S. has withdrawn from a lot of these institutions, criticizing heavily the human rights institutions, for example, or the healthcare institutions of the UN, even withdrawing for a second time from the Paris Climate Accord, just as one of the first decisions after he took office. However, this also highlights that the UN has a lot of issues. So let's not apply our rosy glasses here, because the UN does have a lot of issues. The UN is a fairly old system. It's 80 years old now, and it has so far evaded reforms. Not because there is no need for reforms, but because we cannot simply agree on how best to reform the UN. The best example is the Security Council, for example, where you still have the P5, the 5 permanent members, whose veto powers country to be taken away, and they can block all decisions. That doesn't really that affects their sphere of influence. So as long as these essential core components are not remedied, the UN is just bracing for fires and is in a constant emergency mode. But this also leads to the situation where we are right now. That even regarding migration, even regarding humanitarian affairs, the UN is often regarded as a first responder. That if there is a migration crisis, for example, then the UN is the one who would help. I have very limited experience in this field. I've just worked as an intern for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees back in 2013. But there, I have seen how, for example, tents are being ordered, generators are being brought to these areas. So the UN is actually trying its utmost best with its limited resources to do something meaningful to avoid the loss of human life, to make sure that there is some sort of food, electricity, running water, some sort of clean water or even filtered water there. So it is trying to help. And if you are a refugee, if you are a migrant, if you have experience moving abroad, then the UN is the one through its organizations, through UNHCR and the IOM, that is actually being able to help. It's not an organization that is facilitating in, for example, organizing migration or helping people getting smuggled into countries, but it's simply there to help to make sure that those people who had to leave their country of origin actually survive and they do not die. That's the primary call for the UN. But yes, it's very hard to have, for example, an environmental agenda for the UN if we have major leaders, for example, stating that climate change is not a real thing. So it can definitely undermine the UN's goal by undermining the scientific consensus that has led to these international agreements in the first place. But you're quite right. For peace operations, if we say that the goal is to help, then the UN is applying what we call the concept of positive peace, which is a very holistic approach, meaning that if you have a peace operation, you don't just have to separate the parties, but you have to make sure that the country is sufficiently rebuilt, that there is no further armed conflict, that when the UN peacekeepers actually leave, then the country is in a sufficiently stable situation that it does not collapse. There is no sectoral violence and so on. So it has to think about the cultural, religious, economic, and environmental issues as well. And since around 2007, when then the newly elected Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has announced that the UN should go green, this was the moment when they began focusing on environmental matters as well on the level of peace operations. And indeed, we have a few very good examples where peace operations have been quite successful in this regard. You mentioned migration, not just regarding human migration, but for example, the migration of certain species in the Abidjan operation between Sudan and South Sudan, where one of the reasons that the operation was established was because there was migration. There are groups which are herding cattle, herding livestock, animals from one part of the border to the other. Because in a lot of places in Africa, as you know, I think better than I, borders are very artificial. They don't follow cultural, ethnic, religious boundaries whatsoever. These people have been separated, or several tribal groups are vying for land and for grazing possibilities. So in those instances, for example, where they had, I think, around 80% of the livestock has fallen victim to some sort of disease, the UN has brought in volunteer vets from all corners of the world to make sure that these animals are treated and the livestock are, of course, protected. Now, another thing to note, but I'm just rushing through a lot of ideas here at the moment, is that most of what the UN and most of what environmental protection is right now, at least according to my view, is very anthropocentric. So we're not protecting the wildlife just to protect the wildlife. We are protecting the wildlife because it's the sustenance for those groups. And if those groups don't have sustenance, they might become violent. They might move to other parts, causing migration, causing either non-international or international armed conflicts. So the UN is taking sort of this holistic view of trying to tackle as many issues that it can at the same time, because it understands how these issues affect one another.
I mean, it's so interesting that, you talk about how it's very anthropocentric, the environmental protections, and I think about that because even animals left in zoos, right? Eventually, I mean, this happened in the Ukraine, right? People were flooding to try to rescue domestic animals and also animals that are trapped in the zoos when conflict erupts, and those are captive. But one really big example of sort of the devastation that can happen to wildlife is in the Gulf War. As Iraqi forces retreated from Kuwait, they set fire to like 600 oil wells, and they released deliberately millions of barrels of oil into the Persian Gulf. And that devastated marine life, of course, impacted coastal shorelines, which the vast majority of the human population is actually centered along coastlines. Those are the usually resource rich areas when it comes to food. And it disrupted entire ecosystems, and the impacts lasted decades. And so, but again, tying back to what you said sort of in the beginning, what is the UN's actual capacity to address conflict or climate change? And human migration is going to increase if when we think about climate change and its impact. So do you think that international law can evolve to even recognize the environment as itself, not just in the way that it serves? I mean, of course, I think it will always be in the way that it serves us. We always try to say that, right? We need clean air. Forget about the elephant that needs clean air. We need clean air. We need clean water. We need food security, right? So there's been some kind of, and now I'm throwing out ideas, some kind of point of view of let's label a service that the environment provides, put a economic value on it, and that's going to get us to protect it. But do you think that given that the UN has these sustainable goals, is there a way for international law to recognize the environment? We're seeing this in some states where they are giving rights to rivers, and they're giving rights, right, to rivers in particular. And I had a guest on, about this very topic. If other species or the environment is not considered a victim of war, what would it take to kind of embed that protection into UN peacekeeping? Would it take the collective agreement of all the states?
I think that's a topic that deserves its own discussion because it's so complex. But if I can be a little bit optimistic here, I think that there has been a lot of societal change recently. So if you take a look at some of the newer surveys regarding the attitude of the younger generations, or so millennials and later generations of how they perceive it, they perceive climate change as one of the greatest problems that we're facing. So if we have an ever widening layer of society, or more and more parts of society which are concerned about it, then the parties themselves, whether they be left or right, and the governments that come from these parties will have to respond. So I think we are just ever so slowly pressuring governments into making more robust environmental regulation. But if you take a look at environmental regulation itself, I think it is moving at a tremendously fast speed when compared to human development in general. Because if we say that we have been polluting the environment on an industrial level since the Industrial Revolution in the early, let's say, mid 1800s, early 19th century, that's roughly 250 years of environmental degradation. And the international environmental law on an organized scale has been emerging in the 1960s, 1970s. So if you compare that sort of fast development, well, it's still just COP30, right? Only 30 years have passed, which is, in the long scheme of things, it's not a huge amount of time, and there has been palpable development. And the issue why this can be frustrating, especially to the young people, is because this always has to be sort of the 2 steps forward, 1 step back attitude. Because, for example, just on the level of international norms, for example, yes, we do have treaties. For example, we did have the Kyoto Protocol back in 1997, but it enabled emissions trading. So states didn't really have to reduce what they were putting out, destroying the environment, but they could make deals, how the effects and how the reputation can be sort of mitigated from suffering negatively. So that's sort of half measures, incomplete situations, or the Paris Climate Accord, for example, back in 2015. It's still very widely supported. But what does it say? We have a goal, not having sort of the 1.52% higher temperature than before the Industrial Revolution, but states have to make ambitious contributions. Well, what are those? It depends on the states themselves. For example, France, I think France has promised to gradually phase out, I think, coal by 2030, and then oil by around 2040 or 45, and then gas by 2050. I would say that's ambitious. But can we say the same for other countries as well? Especially if there are countries who are in and out of the agreement. So it can be frustrating to see even from the legal point of view, or regarding the case law of the International Court of Justice. We had the Gabčíkovo-Najmaroš case regarding Danube management of how the water should be let's say, best used between 2 countries. There was a landmark case back in 1997 regarding this, which has, for the first time, tackled some environmental constraints and environmental protection clauses. But it still hasn't been completely resolved because it just said states will have to work it out on their own. We have this decision, we have the guidelines, we have the principles established. Now it's up to you. We're still waiting for it to be fully resolved. Or in the case of, for example, Japanese whaling that was launched by Australia, we also have a case that said that you cannot rely on the reasoning that we are killing thousands of whales per year for research and scientific reasons. We have a judicial decision highlighting that. But then what was the response? Japan left the IWC and never returned. So it is continuing its practice outside of international organizations, and there's very little enforcement mechanisms to make sure that Japan actually copes with these decisions. So we are progressing, but this progress might seem slow and a little bit sort of frustratingly taking often steps back. But just to highlight a positive example here as well, you've mentioned some potentially negative effects for wildlife. We have a positive example from Cyprus, which is a very unique peace operation which has existed for over 50 years now, 60 if I'm not mistaken, because it is separating the southern Greek part of the island from the northern Turkish part. So it has created actually a buffer zone. And this buffer zone is in some places just a few meters wide. However, in some places it's actually quite deep. So in those places, what we have is that some animals have actually set up new habitats. And those habitats are protected right now by UN peacekeepers and by those who are interested. So again, NGOs, for example, local governments are being contacted to provide support. Why? Because these buffer zones have been used as illegal waste deposits. So people have been just throwing junk on the other side of the fence because it's no longer our problem, and poaching has emerged. So even that wildlife that has began establishing its habitats is now currently being trapped, hunted, and then moved away from the country. So the UN is now trying to help it with some tangible results, which is very nice to see.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And, and that's where a benefit of security, because if you have illegal activity of any kind going on in these sort of zones, and you're there, then that's wonderful that it's part of the response. I mean, I think this is a great positive note to end on, and thinking about what would you like to see happen, right? And what are the lessons that we can try to think about moving forward to understand and better integrate the impact of conflict on humans, other species, and the environment, so that we're not just responding after the fact, but building some kind of resilience in our systems now. From your point of view, and taking kind of all the work that you've done on other types of misconduct going on in some of these areas, what do you think should happen? Like, in a perfect world, what would that look like?
I try not to be idealistic, but if I were to have some final takeaway or some recommendation, is first of all to stay positive. So not just focusing on what doesn't work, but what you've actually achieved so far and what our chances are. Because if you're just a young listener to this podcast, then you have a lot of work to do still. So you still have your work cut out for you, because there's still a lot of room for improvement. But the existing organizations can work. So I wouldn't say that, for example, either the UN or the environmental program or the specialized agencies are bad. They have done tremendously good work. But they need to be empowered. They need to be supported, and there needs to be some cooperation based on some common ideas. So let's trust the scientists, because they know what they're saying and they know what they're doing. Let's have a scientific consensus. If we have scientific consensus, then we can have the societal consensus, relying on young people's societal movements, because then they can decide what is important for them. And then politicians will have to follow, and they will have to make the best. The institutions are already there. They're functioning. They have their built their constructed apparatus. We just have to use it. We just have to rely on them. I wouldn't say trust them, because transparency and accountability are still going to be key. But let's give them the tools by which they can actually obtain their mandates. And if they still fail, then we can have critical remarks, then we can have reforms, and then we can see what went wrong and then how to change it. But let's focus on actually building something sustainable that can actually work for future generations as well, and not just for the present.
I sort of feel like maybe the United Nations has a marketing problem, because there's so much good that they have done. And so, but nobody hears about it. It's the same problem of what you focus on, what you put your attention to. So what I appreciate about everything you just said is, okay, let's not be too idealistic here, but let's think about what has been successful and then build on that. But if people have no awareness about what has been successful, so I love the example that you shared about Cyprus and how, now, because there's been this really successful kind of buffer, and look, wildlife will flourish in the absence of conflict, and in the absence of destruction, just like we will, and now integrating some of that protection for them as well. So I don't know. I feel the same about continuing to have hope, but you can't just sit back and just hope for the best. So what are any actions you would suggest for individuals who might want to get more involved in not just understanding the United Nations, but in participating in or contributing to that growth or that improvement, so that we leverage the institutions that we have while seeing them improve, so that those outcomes can be achieved?
You've made an important good comment. So before we get to the sort of practical tips and tricks, there's one thing to note, that one of the most important tasks of the UN Secretary General is actually preventive diplomacy. But this is something that is never going to get mentioned anywhere in the news, right? Because what happens if preventive diplomacy is successful and we avoid a conflict? Does it get to be in the news that there is no war between X and Y? No. It is not. But if there's a failure to be had, then why hasn't the UN resolved the issue between Russia and Ukraine, or brought peace to the Middle East, and so on? So it's always sort of one-sided, that there's always blame to be had, then that's for the UN. But still, even for environmental conservation, the best is to avoid an armed conflict, because that is so detrimental to the environment. And if there are human lives at stake, then the environment is not even secondary in importance, even though we have rules on how to protect it. Just some practical tips and tricks. If someone wants to get involved, there are always opportunities for volunteering. And the UN is now offering, for example, by the way, this is not an ad for the UN, so I'm not affiliated with the UN in any way whatsoever. This is just my 2 cents on the issue. But you can always be a volunteer. And if you go or you apply to an area which is not very frequented, then there's a better chance that you can actually be employed by the UN, because everyone wants to go to Geneva or New York or Vienna, but no one really wants to go to Mali or the Central African Republic or Senegal or these places, especially from a Western country, even though the practical experience that you get from the field in these operations, although it's not always risk-free, is going to be much more valuable. And then once you're in the system, you can actually bring some meaningful change. So that's one key takeaway. The other is that the UN is relying on a lot of NGOs also to help for help. So if you're interested in wildlife conservation, for example, there are plenty of these NGOs working in a lot of countries in Africa, ranging from the Congo to Mali, for example, where you have projects that they're also working on in cooperation, in tandem with the UN. So that's something you can do. I wouldn't say make posters and then disseminate them to your local community, because then I don't think that's the way to go. So awareness raising doesn't really operate like that to the fullest of efficiencies, but just actually go and do stuff. Get out, get yourself something to do, and engage with people, because and this is what I've learned from my international students, that people can have very drastically different outlooks on life, on environmental protection, on just how to live together, but you can learn quite a lot. And the UN is trying to integrate all these different approaches. And if you work for either an NGO or the UN, or for your local community trying to bring some change, you will meet people who will think differently than you. But that can be very enriching.
Yeah.
To see.
András, thank you so much. This has been such a fascinating conversation, and I'm so grateful for your time. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
This conversation reminded me that conflicts aren't just about power struggles. They impact ecosystems. They displace both people and wildlife, and they put a strain and a test on our institutions. Only when we think about implementing reciprocity between us, nature, and governance can we begin to imagine a more peaceful and sustainable future. Next time, we're going to go back to our regular schedule with Tamara Dean, author of Shelter and Storm, At Home in the Driftless. If today was about global systems and the shockwaves they send through all of us, both people and nature, Tamara's episode brings us back home to the local place, and thinking about how place shapes us, how we shelter one another, and how we live well with a more than human world. That would be the natural world. Listeners, if this conversation moved you, I invite you to support our work at Wild Connection. You can find us at www.wildconnection.org. That's where I am working with others to connect people through science, stories, and even music and soccer to inspire conservation action.